Hello, welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to the second chapter, the Book of Eli. We're reading the Book of Eli, not the movie, a book called Eli, a novel. You can see here by Bill Myers. I'm going to go ahead and read chapter 2. But before we do, I'm going to wait a little bit and make sure that somebody connects so I can see if you can hear me well. I hope you are ready. You are excited because I am. I'm going to ask if you're able to hear me. I love the option of being able to do polls here on Facebook Live, so it's so nice. It makes everything easy. Let me see if I can actually look it up myself. Give me a second. I hope everyone is doing good today, or tonight, excuse me. Let me see here. So we're going to be reading the second chapter. Let me see here. Okay, there we go. I can hear it fine. All right, so we're going to be reading the second chapter, and I'm going to go right ahead into it. Chapter 2 of Eli by Bill Myers. Conrad fought his way through the empty blackness. Everything was gone. The city, the laundry room, nothing was there. Only darkness. And the murmur of voices, distant conversations, past and present, snippets of sound. He tried clinging to them, using them to pull himself out of the void. Has he had any purposeful movements since surgery? The sound of screeching tires filled his head, so loud he winced. What was that? The voice asked. Where? His eyes. Probably nystagmus. The voice grew louder, closer. Mr. Davis, can you hear me? Mr. Dave. The air horn of a truck blasted again, drowning out the voice. Can you hear me at all? Conrad tried to answer, mustering all of his strength and will, but it was futile. His body would not respond. The sound of crushing metal filled his ears. Exploding glass shattered around him. Flits and flurries of a crash strove through his mind, but in no particular order. A sheer rock wall. Swish, swish. Swish, swish. More squealing tires. Rain. As he fought the darkness, he tried connecting the fragments together, one way then another. Swish, swish. Swish, swish. The deafening horn. The frightened young face of the driver. More glass shattering, metal crushing. He'd been in an accident. We ran the Glasgow coma a second time en route to the hospital before the surgery. And apparently hospitalized. But what of the baby? The laundry room? Where had they been? Where had they gone? They were so vivid. This entire scene had been as real as any bits he remembered from the accident. Even now he could smell the penetrating odor of marijuana, hear the jingling of beads and bells. Worlds we can't see. Where had he been? And when had he been there? Before the accident? After? Nah, mister, you ain't dead. At least not yet. More shattering glass. Swish, 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 swish. We've come to see the baby. It seemed so real. Santa Monica, 1970. The flower children, the cars, keep tab with the tab. The mother and the baby. He remembered them down to the finest details. We're talking the existence of other realities. You can prove this? He shouldn't be having any residual chemical paralysis at this point. Maybe it was one of those out-of-body experiences somehow connected to the accident. Or a hallucination from all the drugs they were no doubt pumping into him. Or eyewitnesses. People have seen these. I am afraid eyewitnesses would be locked up in insane asylums or in drug rehab programs. Swish, 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 swish. Worlds identical, but with differences. The idea of a savior born in a laundry room was intriguing, and he'd be a fool not to recognize the similarities between what he saw and the Christmas story Suzanne insisted upon reading every Christmas morning. Although he suspected that Away in the Laundry Basket might not carry the same poetic charm as the original. Swish, 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 swish. Worlds identical, but with minor differences. A heavier darkness began to wash over him. Was it possible? He didn't know. Then again, maybe even these thoughts were a hallucination. How could he be thinking so clearly and yet be so... He fought the dullness as it started to swallow him. Maybe from the trauma, the drugs, his imagination, or some combination. Maybe he had entered another world. And if that was true, hadn't Endo said that there were others? Millions? Traveling at different speeds? The darkness was nearly complete, and he still fought it. And if he had entered it once, wouldn't it be possible to Conrad, or excuse me, couldn't he? Conrad's thoughts collapsed upon themselves as he fell back into the silent void. Julia was so lost in thought that she nearly missed the Jans Road exit off Freeway 23 into Thousand Oaks. Fortunately, the early Sunday morning traffic was light, and she was able to swerve sharply, crossing two lanes and barely catching the exit ramp in time. As a girl, she remembered Thousand Oaks being a backwoods hick town with cowboys and horses. Well, all of that had changed. The expansive grass-covered hills with their occasional dual-wheel ruts leading up to the summits has now been transformed into wave after wave of red tile-roofed homes. She could still spot a few fields here and there, even catch the faint odor of dried grass and horse. But it was just a matter of time before that too would be swallowed up by LA sprawl. She turned onto Jan's and followed the four-lane road to the hospital. To her left was a Methodist church with a blood donation banner, hung across the reader board. To her right, a sign posted the speed limit and the words, "Welcome home, relax and slow down." Everywhere she looked, there were houses and trees. Not a billboard in sight. Even the strip mall she passed was signless and surrounded by so much greenery that it was nearly impossible to catch a glimpse of the local McDonald's. She read recently that the city had been voted the safest in America. She could see why. It appeared to be the quintessential American town. Quiet, peaceful, an occasional morning jogger, an elderly couple on bicycles, water from a front yard sprinkler sparkling in the sun. Everything about the city looked safe, quiet, secure. In many ways, it reminded Julia of her own childhood. But looks can be deceiving. Julia, of all people, knew that. She crossed a major intersection, still no billboards or signs, and continued through another residential area until finally a small lit sign came into view. It read, "The Conejo Valley Medical Center." She slowed, took a deep breath, and turned into the tree-lined drive. Eventually, she found the visitors section and pulled into a stall. She turned off the ignition and was surprised at how hard her heart was pounding. She opened the car door, was reminded to remove the keys by the chiming bell, and stepped out into the warm sunlight. Everything was deathly still. Not a hint of breeze, not a sound of traffic. Directly ahead lay the three-story, white and beige hospital. On the pole beside its entrance was the American flag and the California flag, with its brown bear on white background. Both hung lifeless. Overhead, in one of the dozens of pine trees, a crow clicked and cawed. And in the distance, she could hear the dull roar of someone using a leaf blower. Everything else was silent, except for her own breathing and the pounding of her heart. Julia closed her eyes and lifted her face to the warm California sun, feeling it soak into her skin. She took another breath, smelling the morning heat and sun-soft asphalt. Then, excuse me, then she reopened her eyes and started toward the hospital. So do you want to move in for close-ups? A disoriented Conrad turned from the glaring sun. He looked down to see he was standing on a small ridge of sand and bunch grass about 20 yards from a river. The river was good-sized, broad and flat, surrounded sparsely by cottonwoods. Beyond it lay rolling hills, tan and gold, sprinkled with clumps of olive green trees. And beyond those were dark, navy blue mountains, shaded by ominous black clouds. Connie? Still trying to get his bearings, he turned toward the voice. It was Ned Burton, his favorite cameraman. Late 30s, short, scraggly red hair, and a moth-eaten goatee. As a member of the old school who insisted upon producing his own segments, Conrad tried to work with those he trusted most. And Ned, with his experience and dogged tenacity, was always his first choice. At the moment, his eye was glued to the viewfinder of JVC's latest digital camera. A mere $11,673, list price before tax. Top of the line, until next year's models came out. "We got enough on this clown," Ned said, opening his other eye to look at Conrad. "Let's get some cutaways of the audience and get out of here before that storm hits." Conrad turned back toward the mountains. Thunderheads darkened the sky above them. He could smell the moisture in the air. Already a breeze had kicked up. Yeah, he cleared his throat. Cutaways, that'll be good. Without a word, Ned pulled his eye away from the camera, wiped his face with the sleeve, and motioned to the nearby sound man, Mike Horton. They'd only used the mic once or twice before. He was skinny, eager, and Ned's junior by 10 years. As always, he was wearing earphones, holding a boom with a shotgun mic at the end, and doing his best to stay out of Ned's picture. Together, the two half walked, half slid down the sandy knoll to join the outside fringes of the crowd. A crowd that listened to a half-naked young man whose skin was red from the sun and whose sandy blonde dreadlocks fell to the tops of his shoulders. He stood on a waist-deep eddy of the river, shouting at them. "You snakes! You vipers! Like frightened reptiles, you slither from the desert's wildfire, hoping this river can save you. Do you honestly think that there's something magical about this water, or about any water, that can save your souls? In your wildest dreams, do you really believe that all you need to do is to be baptized?" Some of the crowd murmured in resentment. Most simply listened. Conrad carefully surveyed them. He estimated there to be about 5 and 600. 5 to 600 people were standing on the bank of the river in the middle of nowhere, baking in the sun, listening to someone browbeat them. Excuse me, let me reread that. 5 to 600 people standing on the bank of a river in the middle of nowhere, baking in the sun, listening to someone browbeat them. Now, at least he understood why he was out here covering the story. Wherever here was. But why were these people here? As best as he could tell, they came from every background. The rich in their shorts and polo shirts, the poor in jeans and cutoffs, teens in halter tops and swimsuits. He noticed a large number of Hispanics, and by their dress and leathered face, he guessed many of them to be migrant workers. He guessed something else as well. He had not returned to the 70s. There were no painted VW vans, no flower children, just contemporary people with the contemporary cars, soccer mom vans, and the occasional RV. In the distance, he heard thunder rumble. "You say, I'm religious. I believe in God. I'll be saved from the coming wrath." "Who are you kidding?" the young man shouted. "God can raise up religious people from these very stones. And saying you believe in God isn't going to save you. It's what you do, not what you say. Standing in the garage screaming, 'I'm a BMW,' does not make you a BMW. You've got to prove it. You've got to bear the fruit." Someone in the crowd started to shout, but he cut him off. "Save me your doctrines, your pious theologies. Walk the walk, bear the fruit. Do not be like our esteemed leaders who go to religious services Sunday, then continue their adulterous affairs throughout the week. Turn, change, do an about face, or you'll be good for nothing but firewood." Thunder again rumbled in the background. Conrad glanced up. The storm was quickly approaching. He still wasn't sure where he was, though. The desolate hills, the mountains, and the smell of sage made it clear he was out west. Central California, he guessed. maybe eastern Washington. The people had heard the thunder as well. Some were stooping down, gathering their things. Others had already started toward the makeshift parking lot, a flat area just off a single-lane ribbon of blacktop that snaked its way into the hills. For every intent and purpose, it appeared that Conrad was back in his own world. But he knew better. He remembered the accident vividly. He still suspected that his own world consisted of doctors, drugs, and hospitals. He suspected it, but for whatever reason, he was no longer experiencing it. "Who exactly do you claim to be?" an angry man shouted from the crowd. Conrad turned to Ned, who was already zooming in for a close-up as Horton repositioned his mic. The speaker was a distinguished gentleman with gray hair and a neatly trimmed beard. "Where do you come from? What is your training?" "I am nothing," cried the young man. "Just a voice shouting in the middle of nowhere." "Are you the Messiah?" a young mother with a baby called. "The one we've been waiting for?" "No! I am not even worthy to mow his lawn or empty his garbage. I'm only baptizing you with water. But when he comes, he'll baptize you with fire and with the Spirit of God. He will look into your hearts and read them. He will separate you, saving the good and throwing the rest into the fire that burns forever." As if on cue, lightning lit up the sky, followed by clapping thunder that echoed through the hills. The wind grew stronger. The storm was arriving. More people turned and gathered their things, preparing to leave. "Hey, Connie!" Conrad looked down and saw Gerald McFarland, a heavy-set, balding man with a heavy-set, balding man with soft, putting jowls. He was a news producer reporter for the Eternal Broadcasting Network, the country's largest religious network. As usual, he was all grins and good old boy charm. Conrad felt relieved to see someone else he recognized. They both entered the profession at about the same time, and over the years had become friendly rivals. McFarland reporting with his religious bias and Conrad with his hopeful, more objective outlook. Though he knew there was no such thing as a perfect objectivity in their business. McFarland had always struck Conrad as a strange mixture of grace and ruthless ambition. The one moment, the man was all care and compassion, like he was your best friend. The next, he'd be stealing a story right from under your nose. Conrad knew that man's beliefs were sincere. In fact, one teary night at a bar when Conrad and his first wife were separating, McFarland had almost gotten him to consider God. Almost. But there was something about McFarland's schizophrenia that made Conrad nervous. He knew the rules when dealing with other competitors. There were none. In TV journalism, it was every person for himself, and that was okay, because everyone understood it. Everyone but McFarland. Was he your friend or your rival? Was he interested in your soul or your story? No one knew. As near as Conrad can tell, sometimes neither did McFarland. McFarland shouted up to him, "Don't tell me!" The wind had picked up, whipping and snapping Conrad's clothes, drowning out of some of McFarland's words. "Is of secular interest too?" Conrad yelled, "What?" "Here on business or pleasure?" McFarland shouted. "Pleasure?" Conrad yelled. "Didn't you see her?" "What?" "Suzanne's here." Thought maybe you come because of Suzanne." Conrad's heart quickened. He hadn't seen her in 5, maybe 6 years. Not since Julia's wedding. "Suzanne!" he shouted. "Here?" "Yeah! Got some nice shots of her being baptized." Conrad blinked. What was she doing here? Sure, she'd always been the religious type, but there was a brilliant flash of lightning, followed by an explosion of thunder. "Listen!" McFarland shouted. "I'm no rocket scientist, but I wouldn't be standing on top of that knoll in this storm." "Yeah," Conrad nodded. "Thanks." He slid down the hill to join McFarland. Giant drops of rain began plopping as he zipped up his nylon windbreaker. "I'm heading out of SeaTac tomorrow morning," McFarland said. "Any chance of getting together and sharing notes on this guy?" Conrad didn't know how to respond. Tell him he had no idea who the kid was? That he hadn't the slightest clue where they were or how he got there? No. Somehow he suspected that might be a bit more sharing than McFarland had in mind. He settled for something a little more vague. "Let me check with Ned first." McFarland nodded. "Right." He turned and shouted over his shoulder, "I'm staying at the plaza." Conrad nodded. "Got it." The storm had arrived in full force. Now everyone was racing for their cars. Well, almost everyone. When Conrad looked back out to the river, he saw the young man still standing there. He was no longer shouting, and he barely noticed the weather. Instead, his eyes were glued to another fellow, about his age, wading toward him from the opposite bank. The young man had left his shirt on the shore, revealing an upper torso that was lean and somewhat muscular. His features were dark, his hair casual. As he approached, he appeared to be a good 3, maybe 4 inches taller than the first young man. Conrad watched as the two met and exchanged words. Then the new arrival slowly knelt until he was chest deep in the water. He was obviously preparing to be baptized. Not that it appeared necessary. Thanks to the rain, both were already soaked and dripping. The first young man knelt beside him, put his hand behind the newcomer's head, and lowered him backwards into the river. More lightning strobed across the sky, directly overhead this time, followed by loud, ominous thunder. And as the young man rose from the water, coughing and wiping his eyes, a most remarkable thing occurred. A bird, Conrad guessed it to be a dove by its brown and white markings, appeared in the sky, against the black clouds. It descended, flapping its wings, struggling against the wind. Both men saw it and rose silently to watch. Another gust of wind pushed the bird back, but it would not be deterred. It pressed harder, working the currents this way and that, until at last, with the fluttering wings, it landed gently upon the second youth's bare shoulder. In surprise, Conrad wiped the rain from his eyes. But when he looked back, the bird was gone, as if it had never been there. More lightning lit the scene, immediately followed by an explosion of thunder, loud and long. At least Conrad thought it was thunder. But in the midst of the pounding roar, there were what almost sounded like words. Phrases, really. 3 of them, booming, reverberating, as if part of the thunder. He was sure it was an illusion, just the way the thunder echoed off the gillies and river. Still, they were so clear, so distinct. "You are my beloved son, and I am pleased." Conrad glanced back at the crowd. Several of them had heard something as well. Many had stopped and were looking back. Conrad turned toward the river. The two men now stood, locked in an embrace. When they finally separated, the new arrival took the other's shoulder, spoke something, and then without another word turned and headed for the opposite bank, away from the parking lot, away from the crowd. The rain fell harder, blowing and slanting. But through the sheets of water and thick grayness, Conrad saw the young man arrive on the opposite shore, stoop to pick up his shirt, and start toward the distant hills. Julia stepped into the ICU visitors area. It appeared modern and comfortable. The burgundy carpet with its gray geometric designs was cheery without being obnoxious. The abstract paintings of mountains and rolling hills on the wall were soothing. Not far away sat the room's only occupant, an attractive brunette, long, carefully styled hair, high cheekbones, full lips, a figure that was slim where fashion dictated it to be slim and voluptuous, I guess I say it, where it was to be voluptuous. She looked to be in her 30s, but recognizing the tight, shiny skin and other signs of cosmetic surgery, Julia guessed her closer to mid-40. At the moment, she was immersed in the latest Danielle Steele novel. "Roseanne?" Julia asked. The woman looked up, then broke into a smile that was the perfect mixture of pleasure and sympathy. As she rose, she extended her hand and spoke. "Julia." She sounded Latin. And why not? Julia's mother was mostly Irish. Her first stepmother had been Italian, and the woman after that was Swedish. It was about time her father broadened his taste to the southern hemisphere. "I am so sorry," the woman said as they shook hands. Julia gave a tight smile and nodded. She couldn't help noticing the carefully applied mascara that showed absolutely no trace of running or smearing from tears. Not that it should. After all, they'd been divorced for nearly 12 weeks. "How is he?" Julia asked. "From when we spoke last night, no difference, I am afraid." Julia nodded as she took note of the woman's wardrobe. Her silk blouse, diamond necklace, jade earrings, calfskin pumps. She obviously knew how to spend money, which may explain why she was willing to travel all the way out here from LA on a Sunday morning. Of course, Julia immediately felt guilty for the thought. She knew nothing of this woman, nor of her relationship with her father. Besides, they barely divorced, and knowing her father, it was doubtful that he'd yet taken the time to cut the woman out of his will, which could be the very reason she'd gone all this effort to... "Stop it," Julia chided herself. "Stop it this instant. Ernesto and Beatriz will be here soon." Julia frowned. "Who?" "My children." "Ah, yes, of course. They loved your father very much. He had been such a good man." Julia wasn't sure how much of the response was sincere and how much was performance, though she didn't appreciate hearing her father already spoken of in past tense. Still, she felt herself nodding. "Yes," she said, "everybody loves him." Roseanne continued to nod. "Yes, we loved him very, very much." Julia prepared to sit on the sofa across from her when the woman asked, "Do you not wish to see him?" She glanced up. "Pardon me?" Your father, do you want to see him, don't you?" Halfway between sitting and standing, Julia rose. "Well, yes, sir, certainly." Just go to that phone over there. Roseanne pointed to a white phone on the wall. Right, Julia nodded. Of course. She walked to the phone. Dial 423, Roseanne explained. Tell them you want to see Conrad Davis and that you are one of his children. Actually, she was his only child. But Julia let it go as she reached for the receiver. She dialed the number and explained, excuse me, my throat is a little hurting there. She dialed the number and explained to the voice on the other end who she was. A moment later, there was a soft buzz. She pushed open the door, turned to thank Roseanne, and stepped inside. Just ahead and to her right stretched a long nurse's station. To her left were the patients' rooms, each separate and cordoned off from the hall by sliding glass doors, most of which were open. Nearly all contained sleeping or unconscious patients hooked up to various life supports. Julia resisted the temptation to look in on them, partially out of respect for their privacy and partially because she was afraid one of them might be her father. As she approached the nurse behind the counter, she noticed her head was feeling a bit light. Excuse me. Julia cleared the raspiness from her throat and tried again. Excuse me. Uh, the nurse looked up from a chart. I'm his daughter. The woman nodded and pointed toward the far end. Mr. Davis is over in number 4. Thanks, do I just, her mouth was unusually dry. Do I just go in and see him, then? The nurse nodded. Julia felt perspiration breaking out in her forehead. I mean, I don't have to wear a mask or anything like that. The nurse shook her head, then looked at her quizzically. Are you all right? Yeah, I'm fine. The nurse rose and rounded the counter to join her. She was a plump woman, several years older than Julia. Here, let me show you. The room directly across from the station had the number 8 painted on the upper right corner of the glass. You say you're his daughter? The nurse asked as they started down the row, passing room 7. Yes, I just flew in from Atlanta this morning. I met your mother earlier. A charming lady. There was room 6. Well, actually, she's not a... The place seemed to be growing warmer. Julia's head much lighter. She's not my mother. Of course, I understand. Again, she felt the nurse looking at her. Are you certain you're all right? Room 5. It wasn't intentional, but Julia's pace was slowing, her legs growing heavier. Yes, I'm just a little... The door to room number 4 came into view. I didn't have anything to eat on the plane, and there was a foot of the bed. His bed. Then the form under the blanket. Then the stainless steel IV stands. And my head's a little... Then she saw a pale arm taped with tubes and wires. And finally she saw the face. But it wasn't a face. Not really. Just a mass of bandages with plastic tubes and hoses and wires, and Julia's legs turned to rubber. But she barely felt it. All she was aware of were the bandages and the tubes in the nose and hoses down the throat and the wires and more bandages and the hiss click of the respirator and... Ma'am, here, let me get a chair. The voice sounded far away. No, that's okay, she heard herself say. I'm just a little... No way could that be her father. Here, take my arm. She was so strong, so vital. Ma'am, take my arm. The command was firm but growing more distant. Take my arm. And now he looked so lifeless, so her legs gave out. Whoa, hang on, the distant voice cried. She heard the faint scraping of metal legs across linoleum, felt the woman gripping both arms. Just ease back now. Until she was sitting in a chair not 3 feet away from a mass of bandages, wires, tubes, and hoses that were supposed to be her father. The kingdom of heaven is more than just some place you go to when you die. It's a way of life. It's the way God had intended life to be lived. And the good news is you can become citizens of that life right now while you're still on earth. Conrad discovered himself standing amidst a small crowd in the parking lot of a community baseball field. It felt like summer, maybe late spring, with just the slightest trace of a breeze to keep things cooled. Once again, Ned Burton was at his side with his eye to the camera viewfinder. Beside him stood Mike Horton, the same sound man as before. To the immediate right lay a baseball diamond with a sagging backstop in need of repair. I just lost my place. Okay. To their immediate right lay a baseball diamond with a sagging backstop in need of repair. The infield grass could have used more water, and the outfield was encircled by a shoulder-high fence displaying several sponsors' names. Pizza Hut, Barton Auto Repair, Bluebird Cafe. Some recently painted, most in various stages of fading and peeling. Beyond the fence stretched flat farmland, where off in the distance a cloud of dust rolled across a field behind a tractor. As before, everything seemed strikingly real, as real as the world Conrad had left behind. This earthly kingdom has one way of doing things, but it's all backwards. It's all upside down. Conrad focused his attention upon the speaker. He was a young man, just under 6 foot, late 20s, maybe early 30s, Mediterranean look, possibly Jewish, and not a bad build. In fact, his features were much like those of the youth who had been baptized back at the river, whenever that had been. He stood on the rear bumper of a beat-up gray and white RV, speaking pleasantly but loud enough for everyone to hear. The audience of 100 or so were dressed casually. Cutoffs, shorts, tank tops, mostly families, moms, dads, kids. Several of the men and children carried gloves, making it clear that an informal softball game was soon to begin. In this kingdom, if you want, you take. If you want to be great, you conquer people. But in the kingdom of heaven, it is just the opposite. If you want, you give. If you want to rule, you serve. So how do we enter this other kingdom? A heavy-set, middle-aged man shouted, then added with humor, I mean, without dying. The group chuckled. So did the young man. It was interesting that he wasn't haranguing the crowd or preaching at them, as the man back at the river had. Instead, he appeared to be enjoying the easy give-and-take banter. That's a good question, and you may not like my answer. He grew more earnest, carefully looking over the audience. You do have to die. The crowd began to react, but he continued, not physically, no. I'm not saying that, but in order to enter the kingdom of God, You have to die spiritually. You have to die to yourself and come alive in me. The stirring increased, and he held out his hands good-naturedly. I know. To most of you, that sounds incredibly egotistical and arrogant. And I'm sorry, I can't do much about that. But what I can do is tell you the truth. And this is the truth. I am the way to that kingdom. I am the door. More folks shifted and exchanged glances. But he continued, there's no other entrance. There's absolutely no other way to reach God and his kingdom but through me. The restlessness grew. A few began to murmur. I know. The young man nodded in agreement. I told you wouldn't like the answer. But if you stay open, if you drop your pride and humble your hearts, I guarantee you my words will take root inside you and bear fruit. He paused a moment, looking at the ball field, then lifted his eyes and seemed to be gazing beyond, at the distant tractor kicking up dust. When he turned back to the group, he had a mischievous smile. I think I feel another story coming on. Ah, no, the middle-aged man teased. Another one. A few chuckled. An old-timer called out, Tell us your story, son. Tell your story. The young man grinned and prepared to start. He seemed to genuinely enjoy the crowd, and Conrad could tell that, despite his off-the-wall claims, they enjoyed him. Conrad glanced at Ned. Excuse me. Sorry, I glanced over there and I lost my place. But I got it back, so here we go. Conrad glanced at Ned, who was looking back at him with his free eye. Unsure of what to do or even where he was, Conrad nodded to him, indicating that he should continue taping. Ned repositioned himself, relayed the nod to Horton, and zoomed in. The young man began. A farmer went out to plant seed when he was near the road. Some of that seed blew onto the pavement. What do you suppose happened to it? It got squished by a semi, a boy volunteered. The group chuckled quietly. All right, the young man smiled. That's one possibility. Any others? Maybe some animals ate it, the child's father offered. Or the birds got it, another added. The young man nodded. Good. Now another seed fell, but it landed off to the side where the soil was thin and rocky. What would happen to it? The group gave no response. Come on, the young man encouraged. One or two of you are farmers. What happens when seed lands on thin soil? It germinates. It still germinates, a heavy woman ventured. It still grows. The young man nodded. At first, yes. But what happens when the days get hot? When August rolls around and the sun begins beating down on it? The old-timer spoke up. The plant shrivels and dies. It has no roots, the woman agreed. Exactly. The young man stooped down closer to the audience, growing more intimate. He seemed to enjoy producing and urging them to think. Another seed fell along the roadside where the weeds and thistles grew. What do you suppose? You can kiss them goodbye, a good-looking father in his 30s called from the back. Why? The young man rose to his feet to better see him. The weeds are going to steal the nutrients. They're going to choke out the seeds before they ever get started. The young man slowly nodded as he surveyed the crowd. Yes. And then for the first time his eyes connected with Conrad's. They seemed to sparkle, yet were filled with compassion. Although the two of them were nearly 50 feet apart, the experience left Conrad a little disarmed. It was as if he was thinking, or it was as if he was an old friend who knew exactly what Conrad was thinking. "What about the good seed?" someone shouted. The young man turned from him to face the question, and Conrad felt a slight wave of relief. "That, my friend," the young man grinned, "is the good news. Unlike the seed that lands on hearts of hard pavement, where the enemy quickly snatches it away, or on the thin soil where it sprouts until the hot sun of hard times dry it up, or in the weeds of riches and worries that choke it with concern. The seed that lands in soft, fertile hearts will yield an incredible harvest, a crop 100 times greater than what was originally planted." He said no more, but watched in silence as the audience slowly digested the story, several beginning to nod in understanding. Conrad looked on, marveling at the man's ability to weave a story so simple, yet so full of meaning that it held everyone's attention. And his style. Conrad could think of no other description except casual dignity. He obviously had the crowd's respect, but at the same time, he was totally accessible. "Now, I don't know about you folks," the young man grinned, "but I came to watch a ball game." The group voiced their approval and he hopped down from the vehicle dented bumper. "Jake!" he shouted. A burly moose of a man who had already started for the battlefield, or excuse me, the ball field, turned. "Yeah? Thanks for the use of the RV." "No prob," he replied, then turned and continued toward the field. Those who weren't playing started toward their cars or walked to the shaded picnic tables or the bleachers, unsure of what to do next. Conrad glanced back to his cameraman. Ned?" I know," Ned sighed. "Get cutaways of him interacting with the crowd." It sounded like a good idea, and Conrad nodded. "Go to it." The man shrugged, nodded to Horton, and the two moved into the group. "Connie? Connie, is that you?" Conrad turned to see Suzanne approaching through the crowd. As always, she was all grace and smiles. Granted, there were a few more lines around the mouth than he had remembered, and her eyes looked a touch shadier, or a touch sadder. But it was still the same smile that had captured his heart so many years earlier. The same smile that he had turned to tears more times than he cared to remember. "Suzanne." They embraced. She felt warm and good. Most important, she felt real. He held her longer than he should, but he needed to. She'd always been an anchor for him, even after the divorce. And now, wherever he was, whatever he was going through, he needed to feel her support. He needed to feel the familiarity of her presence. When they finally separated, the words tumbled out before he could stop them. It was one thing to exercise restraint around Ned and Horton, but this was Suzanne. Despite the years, there still was a connection. There would always be some part of them that others could not share. "Where are we?" he blurted. "Do you know what's going on?" She tilted her head at him quizzically. "What?" "All of this, it all seems so real." She continued looking at him, still not understanding. He swallowed and regrouped, trying to explain. What about the hospital? What about my accident?" Her expression clouded. "You were in an accident?" "Well, yeah, I mean, were you hurt?" I, uh, His hand shot self-consciously to his face, feeling for wounds, for stitches, for some evidence but the exploding windshield. The rock, the crushing metal. But of course there was nothing. At least not in this whatever or wherever he was. Suzanne continued searching him. Connie, are you all right? He took a deep breath. How could he explain it? What he suspected? How could he explain to someone that they only be maybe only his hallucination, or that he really wasn't a part of their world? How could he explain that he was just dropping in from one of a million different realities that were almost like theirs but not quite? If there are eyewitnesses to such universes, they would be locked up in insane asylums. He opened his mouth, but there were no words. He looked at her, seeing her concern. How could he tell her? What could he tell her? How could he explain something he didn't understand? He couldn't. No, not right now. He needed the reality of who she was. Hallucination or not. Parallel world or not. He needed the simple assurance of her presence. Connie? It took more effort than he had anticipated, but somehow he managed to force a smile. Then give a shrugging answer. It's a long story. She didn't buy it. Not entirely. She continued searching his face. But you're okay now? He nodded and turned up to smile. Yeah, better than ever. And it wasn't a lie, because whatever reality he was experiencing, for however long he would experience it, whether it was real or not, had to be better than the one he'd left behind. Suzanne's expression relaxed, but only slightly. You sure? He nodded. She seemed a bit more convinced as she pushed the graying hair behind her ears. The woman was in her late 40s now, but underneath she was still that same sensitive, compassionate 18-year-old he'd run off with so many lifetimes before. He did his best to change the subject, to try for small talk. You look... You look good, he said. You too. He shrugged, a little grayer and thinner on top. It gives you that wise, distinguished look. Yeah, well, we both know better than that, don't we? Her smile broadened, refusing to let the uneasiness between them return, and intrigued at how real everything appeared, he continued to play along. So, how's Julia and Cody? He's almost 4 now, right? 5, she corrected. And the perfect angel. When he's not being the devil. You know she and Ken separated, didn't you? Conrad frowned. No, I didn't know that. Almost 6 months now. A familiar sorrow crept in. Even in this world, Julia was having her problems. And with his sorrow came the guilt. Not because he hadn't shown or hadn't known in the separation. How could he? He'd not spoken to his daughter in years. Had never even seen his grandson. No, it was from something much deeper. You think to work it out? He asked. With our bull-headed daughter? Suzanne almost laughed. I've got my doubts. If there's any working out, I'm afraid it'll have to be at Ken's end. But I'm praying. Conrad nodded. Good. Good. Looking for another change in subject, he motioned toward the young man. So you found another guru, I see. Suzanne took the barb graciously and turned to the group of people encircling the man. Not another one, Connie. This one's the real thing. There was no missing the quiet admiration in her voice. What Eli has been doing these past several months, his teachings, the miracles, I think we finally found him, Connie. I think we finally found the Messiah we've been waiting so long for. Her words surprised him. After all, she'd been a devout Christian since her 20s. What about Jesus? He asked. Don't tell me you're throwing all that away. Her response was an even greater surprise. Who? She asked. You know, he repeated. Jesus. She frowned as if not recognizing the name. I'm, I'm sorry. I'm not sure who you. She was interrupted by a loud commotion. They turned to see the excitement rippling through the crowd surrounding the young man. What's going on? Conrad asked. Suzanne's face brightened. Probably another healing. Before he could respond, she took his hand. Come and see. As she led him through the group, Conrad instinctively searched for Ned and Horton. Just as he success, excuse me, just as he sus- oh, I can't say it. Just as he suspected, his crew was right where the action was, capturing it all on tape. The young man was speaking to an older, scruffy-looking fellow in a plaid shirt and slightly dirty jeans. His face was leathery and his neck was cross-hatched from years of work in the sun, and his right arm was covered in shiny, uneven scar tissue. Below it, his right hand hung shriveled and useless. That's Brian Tufts, Suzanne half whispered. A farmer here in Oregon. Lost the use of his arm in some sort of fire. The crowd had grown very quiet as the young man, what had Suzanne called him, Eli, wrapped both of his hands around the old-timer's elbow. He was smiling at Tufts, encouraging him not to be afraid, but it did little good. The man's eyes were as big as saucers. It's okay, Eli said. The heat you're feeling is only natural. Tufts tried to nod, but what was not natural was seeing the healed muscle and new pink skin appearing directly under Eli's hand. The old man began to tremble. Sweat appeared on his forehead, but Eli continued speaking words of encouragement, while slowly moving his hand along the arm. As he did, more and more new skin appeared. Everything down to the tiniest detail, down to the bulging blue veins and new hair follicles. The crowd watched in silent awe. Conrad glanced over to Ned. Good. He was getting it all. If this was some sort of parlor trick, they'd be able to examine it more closely in the editing. Eli was down to the hand now, holding it in both of his own. After several seconds, he slowly released it. The crowd gasped. Like his arm, Tuft's hands were perfect. Oh, though as pink as a newborn's. Eli finally looked up to the man with a grin. Tufts could only stare, speechless, his eyes brimming with tears. He looked from his hand to Eli, then back to his hand, then to Eli again. Sorry about the color, Eli shrugged. Guess you'll have to work the tan on yourself. The group chuckled, both at the comment and as a way of releasing tension. Then suddenly the man came to life. He threw his arms around Eli and hoarsely cried, Thank you! Thank you! Thank you! Eli smiled, doing his best to endure the fierce bear hug and trying to return it. Suzanne turned to Conrad and asked quietly, So what do you think? Her voice was thick with compassion, her own eyes glistening with emotion. Amazing. Conrad cleared his throat. I mean, if that's real, it's incredible. Suzanne smiled. Oh, it's real, she said. He does this sort of thing 3, 4 times a day. Sometimes it's the blind. Sometimes it's the deaf. Yesterday, he healed a quadriplegic. Conrad looked on, his reporter instincts telling him to reserve judgment. And it's not just physical healings, Suzanne said. See that guy over there? She motioned to a huge man, a biker type, complete with shaved head, black leather vest and chains. A large gold swastika dangled from his neck. Tattoos covered his forearms and shoulders, so dense that it was impossible to see any detail, except a paisley print of blues, greens, and an occasional red. Will Patton, she said, member of the Aryan Brotherhood. He followed us down from Tacoma. Sweetest man you'll ever meet. I bet. He is. As long as you're not black or gay or Jewish. Oh, really? She smiled that smile of hers and motioned to the crowd. They don't exactly look like your blonde, blue-eyed Germans to me. Conrad looked out across the ball field. He had to agree. There seemed to be a fair number of blacks, Hispanics, and other minorities. For the most part, everyone appeared to be middle to lower class. He turned back to Suzanne. And Eli, he asked, I suppose you're going to tell me he's Jewish, right? Suzanne's smile brightened. Why don't you ask him yourself? Hey, a pleasant voice spoke from behind. Conrad turned to see Eli approaching, his cold black eyes sparkling with pleasure, while at the same time gently probing. My name's Eli, he said. You're a friend of Suzanne's? Yes, that is, we used to be married, Suzanne explained, a long time ago. Conrad Davis, meet Eli Shepherd. The two shook. Eli's grip was firm, his hands somewhat rough and calloused. That was quite the stunt you pulled over there, Conrad said. Eli's sparkle did not disappear. By the look of things, you and your crew have it all on tape. Probably. And if I'm lucky, I might be able to make some late-night filler piece. Conrad smiled at his candidness. If you're lucky. Eli grinned and pretended to quote a headline. Con artist, fools hundreds, film at 11. There was no malice in his eyes, just good-natured bantering. Conrad couldn't help smiling back. That's how it works, of course. If you're the real deal, well, now I'd have myself quite a story, wouldn't I? At least worthy of Jerry Springer. Again Conrad smiled. Despite himself, he was beginning to like this kid. Suzanne says you do that sort of thing all the time. Eli said nothing, but looked over to the crowd and the game that was just starting. The world full of sickness, Conrad. The sparkle faded slightly from his eyes. Unfortunately, most of it is not physical. And you think you can change that? Eli turned back to him. I came into the world to change that. He held his gaze. For the briefest moment, Conrad wasn't sure he could look away, even if he wanted. Sensing his discomfort, Eli's smile reappeared. It was good talking with you, Conrad. He patted him on the shoulder and started to pass. But my team's up to bat and old Jake's at the plate. He motioned to the burly man he thanked earlier for the use of the RV. The poor guy's about 0 for 40 right now, so I think he could stand a little coaching. I hope we can talk again. Me too, Conrad said. Oh, and about that tape. Eli turned. If what you're doing is the real McCoy, I could get you some quality exposure. Thanks, Eli grinned. Don't need it. Then on second thought, he added, but if it's good for you, feel free. In fact, the sooner the better. The response surprised Conrad. Why, what's the hurry? I'm afraid neither you nor I have that much time left, Conrad Davis. With that, Eli turned and headed toward the backstop. The comment left Conrad uneasy, as uneasy as when their eyes had first connected. He couldn't put his finger on it, but if there was the slightest possibility that this Eli was who he thought he might be, considering Endo's theory, considering what he'd seen and heard at the river baptism, considering what he had experienced in the 70s motel laundry room, then there was also a chance that Eli knew who he was and where he'd come from. No, Conrad shook his head. Such things were not possible. "Hey, Jake," Eli called as he approached the backstop. "Sup?" Jake shouted, throwing a look over his shoulder, then taking a few practice swings. "If I were you, I'd keep my eye open for a high lob outside corner." The big man turned to him. He coughed, then spit. "What?" "The next one's going to be on the outside corner." "Come on, Eli." It was the pitcher. He was about the same age as Jake, with the same ruddy features, but with a good 50 pounds less bulk. "That ain't fair." Eli chuckled. "Throw what you want, Robert. I'm just trying to even the odds a little for the big brother here." Turning back to Jake, he repeated, "Watch for the high lob outside corner." Jake scowled and took a couple more practice swings. "But he knows you told me." Eli shrugged. "It's your choice. I'm just making a suggestion." Jake looked back at Eli again, obviously sizing him up. Then turning, he gripped the bat, crouched down, and got ready to swing. Up on the mound, Robert turned the ball around and around in his glove. Then he rolled his head and squinted at the plate. Apparently, this was all part of his pitching ritual. More for superstition and luck than expertise and concentration. "Come on, Jake," one of the kids from his team cried. "Lay into it. Rip a good one." Conrad watched. Obviously, no one knew for certain what Robert would throw to his brother. Still, given Jake's batting average and the amount of muscle and flesh that he had to move, the big guy needed all the help he could get. But the fact that Eli had broadcast it for everyone to hear made an outside lob anything but likely. Or did it? After finishing his ritual, Robert finally tossed the first pitch of the game. Anticipating an outside corner lob, Jake stepped forward. He guessed correctly. He took a hefty swing, grunting like a wounded beast. And to everyone's astonishment, he connected. The bat cracked and the ball sailed high into the sun. His teammates clapped and cheered. So did those in the bleachers. So did Eli. And Jake stood, absolutely mesmerized, watching the ball slowly arch over the right field fence and roll to a stop in the farmer's field. "Run, Jake!" a boy on his team cried. Others joined in. "Run, Jake, run!" But Jake did not run. Instead, he turned to Eli, who continued to watch and grin from behind the backstop. "Run!" But now his entire team was shouting, "Run, Jake!" Realizing he still had the bat, Jake dropped it to the ground. It rang with a metallic clunk. But instead of heading for first, he started toward the backstop. "Run, Jake!" But now the crowd had taken up the cheer. "Run!" But Jake did not hear. Instead, the big man lumbered around the backstop. Eli met him, laughing and slapping him on the back, until Jake threw his arms around him in a monstrous, life-threatening hug. By now, everyone was laughing and cheering, even the other team, even Conrad, because whatever gift Eli may or may not have, regardless of his seriousness of purpose, there was a playfulness about him, a love that was contagious. "Dad, you promised." "Daddy!" The nurse had been kind enough to track down something for Julia to eat. A little toast and some orange juice. Her head had quit spinning, and now she sat all alone in the room. Just her and her father. Eventually, she knew they would ask her permission to pull the plug. What legal procedure they would follow, She hadn't the foggiest, but that was okay. Right now, there was only the rhythmic hiss of the respirator, the green glow of the monitors above him, and her memories. Sweetheart, not now. I'm expecting a very important guest to be coming over. But you said I could. You promised. He looked so small in the bed with its crisp white sheets. So lost, vulnerable. The thick, hairy arms. Ape man arms. She used to tease him. The ones that had carried her, had wrapped around her in the backyard hammock, protected her during scary movies. Now they lay unmoving with IV needles stuck in and taped like he was some lifeless object. His 4-day beard had not been shaved, and there were still a few tufts of graying hair on the back of his neck that the ER had missed when prepping him for the operation. It was that hair that now had her attention. I know I promised, but I forgot. A promise is a promise. You're only as good as your word. Isn't that what you always say? Jules, isn't it? Julia, dear, it was her mother's voice. Daddy's got a very important visitor. But he promised. And you're only as good as your word, right? Right? She's right, he sighed. The memory continued flickering through her mind. He was much younger, in his 20s. He sat on the sofa, and she stood behind him. She held his thick, curly hair in her fingers and carefully snapped in another bright red beret. There were at least a dozen scattered through his hair. Some red, others green or purple, plus a handful of plastic daisies, along with 2 pink rollers from Mom's collection. How much longer? Dad asked, squirming to glance at his watch. Hold still, Julia ordered. Just a few more to go. Jules. Okay, at least let me finish this one. He held still as she clipped in the final barrette. There! Perfect! He rose and turned to her, tufts of hair sticking out in all directions, held in place by the bright hair clips. He was a masterpiece of the absurd. And she broke out laughing. It got no better when he began making monster faces at her and started to chase her around the room until the doorbell rang. Suddenly, the monster face froze. It glanced to its watch. He's early! Instantly, his hand shot up to his hair, yanking out the barrettes, trying to undo the clips. He managed to remove, but most he did not. The doorbell rang again. Want me to get it? Mom called from the other room. No, I've got it. He gave Julie a look. She tried to cover her laughter, but it was no good. The bell rang a third time. With resignation and a heavy sigh, Dad headed for the door. Julia turned and started for cover, but he grabbed her hand. Oh no, you're in on this too. Daddy! She squealed, protesting in delight. Let me go! Let me go! But he did not let go. He reached for the handle and opened it. Before them stood a tall, distinguished gentleman. A gentleman Julie had seen 100 times on television. He had never seen him with such a surprised look as he had that morning when seeing her father. He cleared his throat and in a deep, resonating voice asked, Do I have the right time? Dad grinned sheepishly. Yes, sir, I'm afraid you do. Then glancing down at Julie, he said, I'd like for you to meet my new hairdresser, Julia Davis. This is Walter Cronkite. Mr. Cronkite, my daughter, Julia Davis. And that's the end of chapter 2. I hope you guys enjoyed chapter 2. and you're starting to enjoy the story. It only gets better from here, so continue and waiting and watching for the next one. God bless you all, and I hope you all have a very good week. God bless you. Good night.